start to turn it around.
If we all could love one another, all the world could be as one. Just take time to love one another, all the world could be as one. Black man, white man, standing together, no more fighting to be done. Yellow, red man, dancing together, all the world could be as one.
Good morning. This is Joni Eisenberg with a special edition of To Heal DC on this Indigenous Peoples Day. We are going to be talking with none other than GERALD HORNE. And as we heard Leon Thomas sing about red man, black man, brown man, everyone love one another, we are very far from that in this capitalist nation built on settler colonialism. And of course, that is no accident. We are very proud and thankful to have GERALD HORNE joining us for the hour today. GERALD HORNE, of course, needs no introductions to many of you, but he, of course, is our people's historian, author of 40 and more books, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston. He focuses on class, race, settler colonialism, and fascism. He is very much a part of the PFW family, and I just read that he is the 2023 recipient of Frantz Fanon's Lifetime Achievement Award. And we are spending the hour with Dr. HORNE talking about red, black, and brown histories that we often do not hear about on this day, Indigenous Peoples Day. And of course, it's the first Monday of our pledge drive. We have a goal of $1,000 for this hour. And to make a pledge, you can call 1-800-222-9739. We are offering several thank you gifts with GERALD HORNE, including 2 of his new books. Yes, new books. We will be talking about that in a few moments when we take our first pitch break. But they are 2 new books that I'm extremely excited about. And with that, we have our drum roll, imaginary introduction with our drum roll to GERALD HORNE. Good morning, GERALD.
Good morning to you.
We're very happy you can join us today. And perhaps we can start the day off with a short discussion of the fact that we need a new interpretation of U.S. history in this country. I just read that apparently W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a book on that subject, Propaganda of History. But give us just a brief introduction why we need this new interpretation of this country's history, especially today, but really every day.
Well, we need look no further than to this federal holiday, which in a good deal of North America is, quote, celebrated, unquote, as Christopher Columbus Day. That is to say, celebrating a man who helped to inaugurate an epic of both genocide against indigenous peoples and enslavement of Africans. Also, it seems to me that the left, broadly speaking, has been laggard in this regard. We know that in Australia, which is in some ways a sister or brotherly comrade of settler colonialism in the United States, across the ideological spectrum, left, right, and center, there is difficult to find an event that does not begin without a land acknowledgement. For example, I'm sitting here in Texas. My land acknowledgement would say something like, I sit here on the unceded land of the Comanche people, and go on to talk about the Comanche diaspora and the necessity for judgment to the Comanches. For some reason, land acknowledgements are not part of ordinariness in the United States of America, even on the left. I think it has something to do with this outsized promotion of the 1776 revolt by the settlers against British colonialism in North America. I think that because of that outsized acknowledgement or perception of 1776, I think it leads some people on the left to feel that set the stage for all of us getting justice, which is obviously ludicrous. And as your previous guest in the previous hour suggested, it is extraordinary that we're marking Indigenous Peoples Day on a day in historic Palestine where we see the ugliness of settler colonialism. And what people in North America need to recognize is that what you're seeing right now in historic Palestine pales in significance compared to the bloodiness and the bloodthirstiness that unfolded on this continent. In fact, other than a land acknowledgement with regard to sitting on the land of the Comanche people, I would also like to point out that thankfully there is this movement called Say Her Name. Say Her Name, Sandra Bland. Say Her Name, Breonna Thompson. That is to say, marking those who have fallen at the hands of officers of the state, particularly Black women. Well, in Texas, and I would say broadly speaking in North America, we should have some acknowledgement that would say their names. I mean, for example, in Texas, amongst the indigenous folks who have been liquidated, fundamentally wiped off of planet Earth with barely a trace, would include the Conchos, the Sumas, the Cocayamas, the Mosquitas, the Pacalotes, the Opoxneys, the Conejos. I could go on in this vein, and perhaps I should, in order to give respect to those who have passed from the scene. But this can be found, by the way, on page 26 of my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. And those last words, the roots of U.S. fascism, should also remind us that, in a sense, we've been living in a fool's paradise. There is this idea that the United States and U.S. imperialism can support Israel as it is doing today in its siege of Gaza, that U.S. imperialism can help to impose fascism in Chile, September 11th, 1973, up until the early 1990s. And U.S. imperialism can liquidate indigenous peoples and slave Africans, but somehow we don't have to worry about fascism. I mean, that seems to me is living in a fool's paradise. And we should take note of the fact that fascism is breathing heavily down our necks. And one of the reasons why we need a new interpretation of U.S. history is precisely because the current interpretation provides little or no guidance as to how we got into this pickle and how we can get out of it. Now, fortunately, there have been new interpretations of U.S. history. I mean, for example, let me point to what indigenous scholars or scholars of indigenous studies have been doing. I'm thinking of Ned Blackhawk in his book, The Rediscovery of America. He is, of course, from the Shoshone people from the far west of the United States. I'm thinking of Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who has roots in Oklahoma, and her Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. I'm thinking of Benjamin Matley and his book on the genocide against the indigenous of California. I'm thinking of Kyle T. Mays, also of UCLA, a la Matley, and his book, The Afro-Indigenous Peoples History of the United States of America. And of course, there is a litany of Black scholars who have been trying to reinterpret the history of this country. I'm thinking of the late historian Tyler Stovall, A White Freedom, which is his descriptor and title for his analysis of both 1776 and the French Revolution. I'm thinking of Ishmael Reed, perhaps our paramount Black intellectual, in his send-up of the Disney extravaganza Hamilton, which is played on stages all over the world. I'm thinking Raoul Peck, perhaps our leading filmmaker, former Minister of Culture in Haiti, and his documentary, which is marvelous, Exterminate All the Brutes. I'm thinking of the joint production by Canadian Broadcasting, South African Broadcasting, and BET, Black Entertainment Television, which I understand still has roots in the district, entitled The Book of Negroes, which has remarkable scenes, involving, it's a fiction film, of course, it's a novelization, so to speak, remarkable scenes of a Black woman confronting George Washington in Lower Manhattan after the triumph of the settlers. So this movement with regard to reinterpreting the history of this country is well in motion. The problem is that some of our folks on the left have been slow to sign on. I guess they're satisfied with the old interpretation, or perhaps they would say, well, something akin to Charles Darwin didn't talk about DNA, so why should a biologist today talk about DNA? In other words, our noble ancestors, ideological ancestors, did not necessarily have as acute an analysis of settler colonialism as we do today. So why should I update my knowledge? You know that famous line from poetry, truth is beauty, beauty is truth. That's all you know and all you need to know. Well, some of our friends on the left say they know all they need to know, and they don't need to keep up with these developments with regard to historiography. And that is just one more reason why we're staring down the barrel of fascism.
Absolutely. You're listening to the Gerald Horne, and this is a special edition of Two Heel DC on the first Monday of our pledge drive. And there could be no better next step to what Gerald was talking about than to make a pledge for Gerald Horne's 2 new books. Yes, I'm saying 2 new books. We just offered his latest new book in the summer, but these books are quite different and very, I'm going to say refreshing. Not that all his books aren't. The 2 books are both paperback books. They're a little bit shorter than some of his big books. And the book I've been spending the last week with, or especially the last few days, is called Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with Gerald Horne. And this is written by a younger person, Chris Steele. And I must say, it's very, very engaging because it takes you through Gerald's many, many different books, but through discussion. And it's gotten me to have a new goal in life. I'm going to try to read at least half of all Gerald Horne's books by the time I leave the planet. But that book is available for a pledge of $75. You can call 1-800-222-9739. Pledge of $75 for Gerald's new book, Acknowledging Radical Histories. And he's also coming out with a second new book called I Dare Say. That's coming out in a few weeks. You'll hear more about it in the weeks to come. But that book, I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne reader, goes through different topics in Gerald Horne's work. And it provides illuminating insights on to stem the tide of growing fascism across the Western world. I Dare Say, that book for $100, a package deal for $125 for both of Gerald Horne's new books, Radical Histories, #1 for $75, I Dare Say for $100, both books together for $125, 1-800-222-9739, 1-800-222-9739. Of course, you can also go to the website, WPFWFM.org, and make a pledge. Press the big red button. And those of you who know how to do it can do Cash App, although you need to be very specific with Cash App, $ WPFW. Put the name of the show and your specific gift. We also have another special treat. Gerald Horne will be coming into town the end of October, and on Friday, October 27th, he will be appearing at the Tacoma Park Silver Spring campus of Montgomery Community College, right nearby at the cross section between Tacoma Park and Silver Spring. He will be signing books and speaking at a special youth justice event, social justice event for students and youth. That's a Friday night, October 27th from 6:30 to 9. You can get one ticket for $25, a pair of tickets for $40. So, Gerald, we are very excited about your two new books. Of course, your more recent books are also available for a pledge, and we're very excited you will be coming into town once again to greet us. Gerald, let's move on into the topic. Of course, when we think about indigenous people through the propaganda of this capitalist nation, most people are taught to believe that immigrants are the newest devils and are definitely not part of this country. And when you were talking about the left not acknowledging things, well, it's by no accident that the propaganda machine in this country is hard at work 24/7, keeping people divided. So it's no surprise that we do not know, other than what people who read your books, the history of brown people in this country in terms of people from Central America, South America, and how they are just as indigenous to this land as anybody else. If you'd like to, we're going to in a moment hear a clip from a SNCC activist who recently passed, Hollis Watkins, talking about this subject. But if you want to give an introduction to this theme, which of course you discuss extensively in many of your books, Gerald.
Well, let's begin by talking about the Cherokee people who have occupied historically the southeast quadrant of North America, speaking of today's Georgia, a good deal of Tennessee, a good deal of the Carolinas. Recall that the Cherokees tried to accommodate themselves to the settlers, accommodate themselves to the settlers in a sartorial sense and dressing like the settlers and engaging in sedentary agriculture, developing an alphabet, publishing newspapers, which, by the way, can still be found. And I use them as a source for my aforementioned book on Texas, and not least enslaving Africans, for example. But the U.S. authorities, the settler regime, still decided that they had to go. And many of them were forced at gunpoint to leave what were mansions in the southeast quadrant of North America and engage on what was called the Trail of Tears to what is now Oklahoma, once called Indian Territory, which was supposed to be a kind of Bantustan, an ingathering of dispossessed indigenous peoples, including the Cherokee, but also including the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, to a certain extent, the Seminoles as well, and the Creeks. But of course, as ever, the settler regime did not keep its pledge, even with regard to Indian Territory, and that becomes the state of Oklahoma. You may know that there is a University of Oklahoma, and their mascot is the Sooners. And if you've watched their football games, for example, their game with the University of Texas just this past Saturday, you'll notice that the Sooners make reference to settlers who were able to jump the gun and grab indigenous territory in the late 19th century, going against the pledge of the settler regime that the indigenous territory or Indian Territory would be indigenous land for as long as the river shall flow and the grass shall grow. And of course, Oklahoma today is a citadel of reaction. One of the persons who is now vying to become the next Speaker of the House of Representatives hails from Oklahoma. He will be second in line to the presidency behind Kamala Harris if he is able to prevail, which is weirdly and perversely appropriate, I'm afraid to say. But fortunately, the history of indigenous peoples in North America, of whom there have been hundreds, and I think there's still about 600 federally recognized indigenous groupings, is not encompassed wholly by the experience of the Cherokee. You need look no further than the Seminoles of Florida, who had a de facto merger with Africans, particularly escaping enslaved Africans, involved in one of the bloodiest wars against the U.S. government before the U.S. Civil War, before the treasonous secessionists tried to escape the jurisdiction of the United States so they could perpetuate slavery forevermore. And this indigenous African alliance was so potent that ultimately the U.S. authorities said that they had no alternative but to deport them all, but to expel them all. And I'm afraid to say, although I trust that I will be mistaken, that in some ways tracks what has happened in historic Palestine, where you've seen a systematic expulsion of the indigenous population, the ingathering of a favored group, speaking of those who are designated as Jewish and or Zionists, for example. And it's appropriate on Indigenous Peoples Day, 2023, to recount this ignominious history in North America, but then struggle not only to make sure that Indigenous peoples of North America receive justice, but the Indigenous peoples of historic Palestine receive justice. Because we should recognize that in some ways, speaking optimistically, we may be involved in the last chapter of this despicable period in history of settler colonialism, which not only afflicted historic Palestine and North America, including Canada, but also Australia, New Zealand, Algeria, where, of course, the settlers were defeated by the Africans in 1962, or what is now Zimbabwe, where the settlers were defeated by the Africans by 1980. And by the way, the settlers in what was then called Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, said that they were walking in the footsteps of 1776 when they revolted against British rule in 1965, because they thought Britain was moving towards one person, one vote, meaning African majority rule. And there was a perception in 1776 that Britain had become rather lukewarm with regard to waging war against the indigenous of North America in order that land speculators like George Washington could profit handsomely. Not to mention that as of 1772, with Somerset's case, England had moved, it was thought, towards abolishing slavery in England itself. And so there is a lot to be learned with regard to this period of settler colonialism, which has ensnared the United States of America. And once again, our friends on the left really need to engage not only in serious self-criticism, but serious education, so they could come up to speed and be able to assume the vanguard role in terms of fighting the pernicious system.
Absolutely, Gerald Horne. And of course, I couldn't agree with you more, particularly, well, about everything you said, particularly, though, about what's happening in Israel and Palestine, that it is frightening. It is certainly something that many of us who consider ourselves Jewish are on the side of the Palestinians, and we are often used to pit everybody against each other. But I want to jump in right now for a moment, as you talk about, Gerald, often in your books, what's often not mentioned enough by anyone, including the left, is the fact that the so-called immigrants who are coming in from Mexico, Central America, South America, who are being demonized by the powers that be in this society, they are indigenous people to this land. We stole, not we, but the capitalist rulers of this land stole, as you very clearly describe in your books, Texas and many other states, which were originally belonged to Mexico. We're going to jump into that discussion more, but we're going to hear first a short clip from SNCC activist Hollis Watkins, a student nonviolent coordinating committee activist, close friend of our own Dory Ladner and Joyce Ladner, who just passed on September 20th, born in Mississippi, involved with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and much more. So let's hear what he has to say about this question.
So when I look at our brothers and sisters that's from South and Central America and how they are attempted to be barred from coming into this country, I realized that at one particular time, especially the southern part of the United States, that was land that their foreparents owned, worked, and made a living for themselves and their family. And now we find people in this country attempting to keep them out. And to me, they're just simply attempting to come back home. Because, as I said, that part of the United States was illegally stole and hijacked, in one sense, from the people that is in South and Central America. So they have a right to come back home and utilize that land which their foreparents once occupied. And I feel that it is my obligation to aid and assist, and do all I can to help them overcome that barrier. Because, as I was saying, the same things that Black people have had to go through in this country, we find that people from South and Central America in particular are having to go through those same things as it relates to jobs, places to stay, and especially for those that are working in the agriculture sector.
Thank you, Hollis Watkins. Hollis Watkins, who left us physically on September 20th, just a few weeks ago, thanks to Greg Carr, who played this clip on his weekly YouTube In Class with Carr. And of course, he honored, as I will, Dory Ladner and Joyce Ladner. Dory is very much a part of our WPFW community and very close to Hollis Watkins. You're listening to WPFW 89.3 FM. This is Joni Eisenberg with To Heal DC special show today with Dr. Gerald Horne. This is the first Monday of our pledge drive, and we have some wonderful thank you gifts to share. We have no pledges yet, and folks, we usually have quite a lot of pledges by now, but we know that you can think about it and know that you need, that we are very important, WPFW as a station here in Washington, D.C., very important, especially during this period in time when fascism is unfortunately right at our doorsteps. And of course, Gerald can say a few more words about that, but you can please make a pledge, 1-800-222-9739, 1-800-222-9739. Be the first person to pledge today. We usually do make our goal. We know we can do it today. Again, you can pledge for 2 new books. And these are smaller books. These are compilations of Gerald Horne's work. Radical Histories can be yours for a pledge of $75. I couldn't put that book down. It got me inspired to read. Of course, I've read some of Gerald Horne's books, but not nearly enough. This book gives you sneak previews of and a deeper understanding of what some of those books address. That $75 pledge, I dare say, another new book coming out in a few weeks, a Gerald Horne reader, a pledge for $100, and the package together is $125. You can again call 1-800-222-9739. Gerald is also coming in a couple weeks, the end of October 27th, at a special event at the Montgomery Community College in Silver Spring. You can get one ticket for $25, the pair of tickets for $40, and hear Gerald Horne as he speaks as part of a social justice event for students and young people. Again, you need to call 1-800-222-9739, and we are eager to thank the first pledgee for this program. Gerald, anything you'd like to share about your upcoming, these two new books that are coming out soon?
Well, let's take I Dare Say. As you suggested, it's a compilation of articles I've written and essays I've written in recent decades. I would point, amongst others, to an essay I wrote on the lumpen some years ago. This was a concept, you may recall, that was popularized by the now defunct Black Panther Party, was then adapted and adopted in Southern California by those who considered themselves to be, quote, gangster rappers, unquote, helping to turn this term gangster into both not only a noun, but also a verb. And so I've tried to provide some historic context as to how that happened and what it means. There is an essay about one of our most significant victories in recent decades, the coming to independence of South Africa in 1994, and the role of folks on this side of the Atlantic, not least in the District, Maryland, and Virginia, in terms of bringing that accomplishment to victory. I talk about the erosion, the collapse, if you like, of the socialist camp and the devastation that wreaked upon Africa, and also, by the way, on African Americans as well. Now, with regard to this other book, Acknowledging Radical Histories, it's conversation, so it's in a conversational tone, needless to say. And I talk about some of the events that helped to shape me. For example, listening to Hollis Watkins allows me to say that what helped to shape me as an individual and ultimately as an activist and a scholar is listening to my parents, both of whom had roots in Mississippi, regale me with tales of the horrors of Jim Crow Mississippi and what it took to survive in Jim Crow Mississippi. And so that has led me today, as we speak, to help to endow a prize of $1,000 or more for the best manuscript in Native American studies, because I became convinced early on that you could not separate the horrors of Jim Crow Mississippi from the violent uprooting and dispossession of the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Natchez, etc. However, despite what I said a moment or two ago about these new histories, we still lack histories that connect these two important contexts. That is to say, how indigenous dispossession led directly to the horrors of Jim Crow inflicted upon Black people. And so I'll be talking about that more during my journey to Montgomery College on Friday, October 27th, and other events that I'll be speaking at during that brief stay in your region.
And we certainly look forward to that. And perhaps you could spend a moment. Of course, there's so much we want to try to cover. And you so beautifully describe the connections between the red peoples, Black peoples, brown peoples. But perhaps you could spend a moment talking about, I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted here, talking about why Pacifica, as I've heard you say often, and particularly WPFW, the only Pacifica station that is really led by Black people, managed by Black people. But in general, why PFW and Pacifica is so important at this moment in time, this very moment, and why people should pledge.
Well, if you can stomach it, turn to other spots on the dial and listen to what's being said about the crisis unfolding in historic Palestine. If you can stomach it, turn on your television set and watch supposedly the left of that dial, speaking of MSNBC, and see what they have to say about the crisis in historic Palestine. And then, in order to find an oasis in this otherwise parched desert of media, tune into WPFW and get a more accurate depiction of what's happening. And that is one of the reasons why WPFW is perpetually under siege, because it does not necessarily toe the line that the U.S. ruling class wants WPFW to toe. That is why, for example, the Pacifica station in Houston, Texas, where I'm now speaking, has been subjected to bombings, believe it or not, over decades. So this is important, it's crucial, it's critical, it's mission critical to make sure that WPFW has sufficient funding to make sure that the staff is adequately compensated, that the lights stay on, that the tower remains functioning, because it would be a victory for the exploiters. It would be a victory for the billionaire class if somehow, some way, WPFW were to be driven from the airways. But I know that that's not going to happen, because I know that we have a faithful listening base that refuses to allow that to happen.
Absolutely. And we do have one person we'd like to thank. Thank to our first pledgee, Wendell. He's getting the book on radicalism, and that would be, what book would that be, Gerald?
Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations.
Yes, and that is, I can't recommend that book enough. Gerald calls it conversational, but it's very, very informative, because it takes you from many topics in a very interesting way, and also convinces you that you're going to want to read more of Gerald Horne's books. Gerald, perhaps we could spend a few more minutes talking about the solidarity that is never really discussed between so-called red peoples and black peoples in this country, and perhaps talking a little bit about Florida.
Well, you know that I mentioned that a moment or two ago with regard to the alliance that unfolded in the Sunshine State between the indigenous of Florida and the Africans, but it even goes back to the Spanish period. Recall that the Spanish settlers invaded that peninsula circa 1565, well before the English settlers had established a toehold in what they call Virginia in 1607. And what's interesting in terms of this conflict that then unfolded between the Spanish on the one hand and the English on the other, because the Spanish had as a major marker of society religion, that is to say, Catholicism, it was easier for them to absorb Africans even into the military, whereas the Londoners, contrarily, had as a major marker of society this concept of, quote, race, unquote, which marked Black people in particular, or any who were not allowed to be inducted into the hallowed halls of whiteness, as being basically polecats. And this came to a head in South Carolina when you had the bloodiest revolt of the enslaved in the history of British North America, speaking of 1739 and Stonewall's Rebellion, when you had Africans in Spanish military uniforms coming across the border from Spanish Florida to stir up the Africans in South Carolina and encouraging them to revolt, which they fundamentally did. Keep in mind that as we speak today, it's no accident that the three most populous states under the U.S. flag, California, Texas, and Florida, formerly were under the Spanish flag. And what that has left behind are what might be called these lingering questions of nationality, not only involving Black people, not only involving the indigenous, but, for example, in the state of Texas and to a degree in the state of California as well, this question of the fate and destiny of people of Mexican origin. And as Hollis Watkins said in that brief clip that you played, what's remarkable about the population of Mexican origin is how so many of them in another context would be referred to as indigenous peoples. That is to say, once they cross the border, they're dubbed for various reasons as being Mexicano or Chicano or Mexican origin. But in some sense, what they're doing, they're recreating what their ancestors have been doing for centuries, which is crossing back and forth in this territory of North America. And now, of course, with this settler regime in Washington, they have bent over backwards to try to stop that historic practice, leading to this harebrained scheme now carried forth by the Biden administration to build a wall alongst the border, which I'm happy to say will be easily traversed. Not to mention even more draconian measures imposed by the settler government in Austin, Texas, which is moving step by step towards something we are reluctant or loath to confront, but is embodied by recent comments by the odds-on favorite to be the Republican nominee for president, speaking of Donald J. Trump, when he tore a page from the playbook of the Nazis of the 1930s by claiming that people who are crossing or, quote, poisoning the blood, unquote, of the United States of America. That rhetorical demarche is a prelude, a precursor, I'm afraid to say, for something even more diabolical and despicable if we're not careful.
Absolutely. And certainly we are on a very frightening precipice in this country and in this world of ours. That's why it is so important that we protect and preserve and strengthen WPFW, and that you spend some time checking out GERALD HORNE's books. And GERALD HORNE, perhaps better than anyone, describes the inherent solidarity between so-called red people, brown people, black people in this country. And in a moment, he will also talk about the critical importance of international solidarity. But before we go there, we again want to encourage you to pledge. We only have had one pledge so far. You can make a pledge by calling 1-800-222-9739, 1-800-222-9739. Maybe Katia, we should make a song, a hip hop song with those numbers. 1-800-222-9739. You can get one of GERALD or both of GERALD HORNE's new books. We're just first talking about it now, today, the first day of the pledge drive. The first book that is already just come out, Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with GERALD HORNE. It has about maybe 10 chapters. It's a shorter book, about 180 pages, very, very readable. Can be yours again for a pledge of $75. Other book coming out is I Dare Say, a compendium with GERALD HORNE, lots of different topics, illuminating insights on many things, including the issue of fascism. That can be yours for both books for a package deal of $125, 1-800-222-9739. And of course, down the road in a few weeks, you can get a ticket to see and hear GERALD HORNE as part of the Montgomery College special event Friday evening, October 27th, a student youth conference on justice, $25 for one ticket, $40 for the pair of tickets. And of course, we have many other thank you gifts, including some of, if you call that number, 1-800-222-9739, you can be reminded of GERALD HORNE's other recent books that we've offered, as well as whenever GERALD's on, we like to also acknowledge you can make a pledge for Paul Robeson's 125th birthday package, as well as, as GERALD would be happy to talk about We Charge Genocide. We Charge Genocide is also a thank you gift. And unfortunately, that topic is very relevant for today, Indigenous Peoples Day. We Charge Genocide. And GERALD, jumping back with you, you talk often in your in your book that I've been reading this weekend, Radical Histories, about the importance of international solidarity. So share with us why that is so important. And when you're speaking to the importance also of the left being more in solidarity with progressive communities across the world.
Well, if you look at how the United States was able to escape the ravages of Jim Crow, that was not only due to relentless struggle on these shores, it was also due to a changing global climate. That is to say, as African and Caribbean nations were surging to independence in the 1950s and the 1960s, Washington found it difficult to appeal to hearts and minds in these strategic regions as long as Jim Crow governed the land. You saw this particularly in the District of Columbia, and I deal with that at some length in my DC book, Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, DC, 1900 to 2000. And so we cannot even begin to understand how U.S. apartheid began to erode without understanding global solidarity in the international climate. Likewise, with regard to the collapse of slavery in North America in 1865, that has everything to do with the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which created a general crisis of the entire slave system that could only be resolved with its collapse. That is to say, with the triumph of the unpaid sector of the working class in what is now called Haiti, you saw that Britain decided that the better part of wisdom was to withdraw from the African slave trade by 1808, because by bringing more enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, they were only bringing more grave diggers for their iniquitous system in Jamaica, Barbados, etc., and then withdraw from slavery altogether by the 1830s. And so we cannot begin to understand slavery's collapse without understanding international solidarity. Likewise, my foray into indigenous history helps to convince me that one of the many reasons why indigenous people were subjected to genocide in North America and formidably liquidated is because of the fact that it was not easy for them to get allies globally in the 19th century. And by the time the 20th century rolled around and the global climate began to change, many of these indigenous people, some of whom I mentioned them in a litany at the top of this program, had been eliminated. And so likewise, going forward in the 21st century, to think that we'll be able to escape the ravages of fascism without not only a strict solidarity domestically, but global solidarity is a fantasy. And speaking of that latter point, I'm disturbed to note that the defeat of fascism in the 1940s and how that was attained, that lesson is now being ignored today because it took an all-hands-on-deck approach to defeat fascism. That is to say, the United States decided to erode temporarily its anti-communism by entering into alliance with the then Soviet Union, which helped to defeat German fascism and ultimately helped to bring to book Imperial Japan as well. But I don't get the understanding in 2023 that that particular lesson has been absorbed. Sometimes I think our liberal friends feel that they can continue to pursue their wrong-headed policy of acting as any forces to their left are either radioactive or do not exist, which is fundamentally a gift to the ultra-right who have as a goal liquidating us all.
Absolutely. And of course, one of the acts of solidarity, Gerald, that you know quite well, is the Lincoln Brigade, when people actually went from this country to Spain to assist in the fight against fascism. And of course, people like Paul Robeson very much involved with that. We only have a few minutes left. I don't know if this is a question you can answer, but how would you envision international solidarity among progressive people in this country right now, as particularly as we face this not new but crisis in between Israel and Palestine? How can solidarity be manifested here?
Well, we saw that solidarity on the streets of Manhattan in the last 24 hours when hundreds, if not thousands, took to the streets in solidarity with besieged Palestinians. This was part of a global manifestation. We certainly need to see more of that. Likewise, we need to see more attempts by the movement in this country in favor of having Black Lives Matter reach across the border to our friends in Mexico, to the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, Switzerland, to the African Union in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. That is to say that the correlation and the balance of forces are such domestically that I think it's folly to assume that we can defeat this monster we're encountering by ourselves. That has not been the lesson of history in North America. I dare say that it won't be the lesson that we're able to absorb in the 21st century. And I think a step in that direction is making sure that this station, the little station that could, WPFW, remain vibrant, remain strong. And that involves, of course, picking up the phone and dialing. What's that number again?
1-800-222-9739.
Of course, and not to mention going online and making a secure pledge, because barring that, our fate and our future will be dire indeed.
Absolutely. And we do have two more people we want to thank. Diana is getting your book on Revolting Capital, Dr. Horne's book. And we have Anonymous out of Bowie. He's getting the same book. Again, you can call 1-800-222-9739, 1-800-222-9739. We only have $675 to go. And I know that can be done in 6 minutes. We've done the same over the years. 1-800-222-9739. That would be if just 7 people or even 6 people pledged $100, we got it. And as Gerald said, we need this station now more than ever. We need to be strong as we face impending doom of I hate to say the whole planet with global warming. And certainly this war, that just started on Friday, or although it has roots over 70 years or more, is a very frightening scenario over there in Israel and Palestine, not to mention the ongoing battle in the Ukraine. This is a time that we all need to come together, progressive people. Another thank you gift to Rachel and Wendell pledging again, getting a ticket to the Montgomery College event. We only have $500 to go, folks. $500 in 5 minutes. We can do it. 1-800-222-9739. Pledge for a pair of those tickets for $40 Friday, October 27th. Be part of a youth justice event at Montgomery Community College with Gerald Horne. I can't imagine a better way to spend a Friday evening. And also, you can pledge for 2 of Gerald's new books for a package amount of $125, Acknowledging Radical Histories, or I Dare Say. And I dare say we are in a very precarious, frightening situation in this nation and this world, but WPFW can be one important part of making it better. We have another pledge from Barrington Williams, getting Revolting Capital. $400 to go. We just have 4 minutes. We know we can do that in 4 minutes. We've done a lot more than that. We the progressive movements in this city, in this country. 1-800-222-9739. Get any one of Gerald Horne's, either his new books for a package of $125 or other books. Thanks to Dick from Annapolis. Just $365 to go, folks. You always come in at the last minute. 1-800-222-9739. 9739. We have wonderful thank you gifts, including Gerald Horne's books, new books, his older books. We also have, you can always get We Charge Genocide. That certainly is good for today. We Charge Genocide, or Paul Robeson's birthday package, 1-800-222-9739. Let's have a pledges of solidarity amongst us all. Solidarity among Black people, brown people, red people, yellow people, all peoples. We are divided in this country. This settler, colonialist, capitalist country is set up to keep us divided. And they do so very well. But we are a force standing up against that. That's why we need to be stronger. If some of you have been watching the TV, and I agree with Gerald, I cannot stand to watch the propaganda, particularly around what's happening in Palestine. They never show the killings, all the decades of killings against Palestinian people that Israel has been carrying out for decades. So we're combating a very powerful propaganda machine, and we need your help, your solidarity. So make a vote for solidarity with WPFW, for solidarity with all peoples of the world and of this country, that we are being kept divided by this capitalist country. 1-800-222-9739. It's not funny, but we need your support. We have 2 minutes to go, folks. 2 minutes to go. We know you're out there. We know you support us. Make a pledge. You can call the station if you don't have the money right now. Put it, as we call it, on layaway, but make a commitment to pay in the future. 1-800-222-9739. You can also make a sustaining pledge for $20 a month to WPFW. That many of you can afford that. 1-800-222-9739. Make a pledge for our, I think it's our 46th birthday of WPFW. And people are texting me. If you want to make a pledge, use the phone, 1-800-222-9739. Gerald Horne, you will have about 30 seconds to make your final statement.
Well, I'm happy to see that my book, Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000, is still striking a chord with many of your listeners.
This is a postscript to WPFW's October 9th, Indigenous Peoples Day, Red, Black, and Brown Histories with Dr. Gerald Horne. Listeners came through loud and clear in the last few moments of this hour with donations of over $1,500. We thank you.
If we all could love one another, all the world could be as one. Just take time to love one another, all the world could be as one. Black man, white man, standing together, no more fighting to be done. Yellow, red man, dancing together, all the world could be as one.